Hi, so if you've been following these lectures, you know that we're basically rewriting, you and me, together, history. Not just in the United States, but all over the world. That makes more sense, right? Because the United States is a fairly new country, so you can't separate its history from European history. And in fact, that's the main reason why Americans don't know their own history. And unfortunately, are, as a result, unable to see that they're replicating a lot of the problems that happened in Europe. So, the other reason that we're doing this is because, number one, we're in a unique position. If you're in your 30s or 40s in the United States, you have seen something that almost nobody else in human history has seen. Namely, the rise of an empire and its decline. Most of the time when empires go up and down, it's not quite so sudden. There's usually a war, a civil war. Look at Germany. It could be considered an empire, but of course it was a very short one, not a sustainable one at all. You can't really call it an empire because we don't necessarily mimic its cultural values at all. Hopefully not. So the other issue is that in human history, most of us have been illiterate. And even aside from this fairly new mobile technology that allows me to record this at a reasonable cost, even if you wanted to tell your story, you probably couldn't, either because of communication issues or some other kind of issue. So the reason we're doing this is because we are, by virtue of timing, as an American, in a very unique position. And so we've covered a lot of different themes. We've covered the theme of what happens to societies when governments move away from funding themselves and operations based on taxes and move into a situation where they shift to the more easy funding mechanism of debt. And we've talked about when that happens, especially when you run deficits on a regular basis, especially when those deficits tend to fund things like insurance, military protection, just protection overall. There's a tendency to become similar to the mafia or to suppress creativity. Because once you move away from being funded by taxes, what's happening is you have to favor banks over individuals, the banking sector over citizens, which also puts citizens at a disadvantage because they're now competing with a globalized banking sector. And globalization has far more advantages than a purely domestic policy. So when that happens, you're already at a disadvantage. We've talked about that. We've talked about how the United States has been insincere in its efforts to resolve its issues, especially racism. So, for example, instead of focusing on segregation, the United States has instead focused on cosmetic changes like affirmative action, and as a result, is still dealing with almost the same issues as it's dealt with throughout the last 100 years. We still have segregation. We just don't have it in an overt way. So we went from having a system of Jim Crow, what's called de jure segregation, to now de facto segregation. We talked about how that ties into a post-World War II system of divide and govern, not just in the United States, but all over the world. A very easy example of that would be the new country of Israel, where when it was first created, the idea would be that the Gaza Strip would be for the Muslims, that Israel proper would be for the Jews, and the West Bank would be for the Christians. And remember, I just said that when you move from a taxpayer-funded system into a debt-based system that favors a military-industrial complex, What ends up happening in that position, in that situation, is that you lose individual agency. And so when that system, to the extent that it's successful, prevails overseas, its lessons are then applied domestically. And so it shouldn't surprise anybody that American sociologists studied, in fact, what was going on in Germany. In other words, a lot of there's some overlap. There's evidence of some overlap of Jim Crow and I believe what was called Nuremberg laws, essentially separation laws and miscegenation laws. That, should not be a coincidence. So we've talked about how there are really no coincidences. A lot of the problems that we have today persist because we have failed to fix fundamental issues. And again, attempted to paper over those issues by media charm or highly evolved propaganda in order to maintain the status quo. We've talked about how governments that have failed to harness a technological standard have ceded power and influence to private corporations, especially in the United States, which then results in further fragmentation. So you have a society that is already segregated based on race, based on wealth. And then on top of that, in the 21st century, you then move into a society that is further segregated based on technology and based on access to technological products or particular platforms that are more secure than others. So we talked about that. We've talked about why competing countries, in particular China, that have a more centralized system, have been more successful in creating a middle class and more successful in maintaining credibility because the centralized system overlaps almost perfectly with the idea of technology seeking out a single standard that is most secure. And so in the United States, we have multiple standards. We've got, for example, if you want to think of it this way, we have a Google standard, an Apple standard, a Samsung standard. We have a Android. We have, Amazon. We have different platforms. And until recently, there was an argument that even the APIs, an interface module of some sort, could be protected through intellectual property designations. We've talked about how the lawyers have failed, especially in the United States, by shifting away from protecting the individual into things like impact legislation, or impact litigation, I should say, and have also become, for the most part, divorced from the impact of their programs. So the political sector on the civilian side has shifted into essentially governance by fiat in a way that insulates the legislature's ability to carry out the programs that it's passing on the ground level. And so if you want to think of it another way, if you have a country run by lawyers, but is actually on the ground level effectuated by the executive branch, to the extent that the lawyers are failing and have failed, the executive branch essentially either takes over overtly, the executive branch, which would include the military and the police, or the executive branch rebels against authority. And so that is, again, in a nutshell, what has happened in the United States. And it also explains why the United States has maintained such an imbalanced budget and such imbalanced spending, which tends to favor not just the status quo, but the shift post-Vietnam into a society that has become a trickle-down economy that is essentially run on military spending and an informal alliance, or perhaps in some cases a formal alliance, between military spending and, in some cases, private corporations and or think tanks. The internet being one example. We put all those things together, those would be the major themes that I can think of right now. And what I want to do is segue into this idea that I discussed before, yesterday, of the idea that the intangible is really what drives society, not the tangible. And the way I want to explain it to you is the way I've been explaining it to you the entire time. So you've got these beautiful houses, and these beautiful houses, of course, look like they're fairly stable. They look like they're evidence of prosperity. If you look at the cars, a lot of them are new, they're innovative. But if it's all based on debt, in other words, if it's based on a system of debt that is unsustainable, then it's not really prosperity. It's just evidence of a failure of governance, especially with respect to the banking sector. The other evidence for that, of course, is the collapse of the economy in 2008-2009, in the worldwide, not just the United States. And so one of the reasons that it's so difficult to see when your society is declining is because, for the most part, societies in modern human history that have managed to become empires have done so by becoming experts in technology, science, and math, and probably these days automation. And so when you create a society where those are your primary values that are then buttressed by debt in an unsustainable manner, what is really happening is the prosperity that you see is almost a given, but it's actually hollow. Remember, it's not a sign of prosperity. Your eyes are fooling you. It's a sign of an unsustainable economy that has favored the big over the small, the banking sector over the individual, and is therefore not sustainable. And the reason it's so hard to realize that you're in an empire that is in decline when you're in the middle of it is because it looks like everything is going well. If you are me and you haven't traveled the world 4 times, you look around, and as far as you're concerned, especially compared to the chaotic streets of Manila or the chaotic streets and unpaved roads of Jakarta, if you go to those places and you come back here, it feels and looks as if the society has a brighter future. But that's because we can't see the debt that's supporting all of this. We can't see that this is all being supported by negative interest rates, which, if you've studied Economics 101, should not happen. No, negative interest rates mean that you are paying somebody to hold your money, and they are going to charge you for holding your money. I thought that was what a bank account was supposed to do. So that shows you again that debt just wants to be rolled over. It wants to perpetuate itself at the expense of principles that are sustainable. You put all that together, and you realize that the intangible matters more than the tangible, especially now when the when the best, or I should say the top performers overall, when measured by GDP, are the societies that are doing everything they can to gather data that shows that they are succeeding. But of course, again, the problem with this paradigm is that if the intangible is what is really driving society, then a society that's based on surveillance, data gathering, and the most secure technological standard is going to tell you right up until the very end that it is the most successful paradigm and the most successful structure, legally and otherwise, because it is harder to argue against the tangible than it is against the intangible. In a sense, the intangible is speculative. So if I put you in the middle of Manila, especially in a barangay that is not as affluent as say, the Fort Bonifacio, which is, by the way, military spending, the Fort Bonifacio. If I show you that away from the fort and I bring you to, say, a place in Jakarta, or even a place far away from Jakarta that hasn't had the opportunity to be developed because it just doesn't have access to banking loans or international funding loans, and you come over here and I show you these beautiful houses, again, you're going to tell me that I'm wrong. Because the human animal is overly dependent on the visual. And we sort of understand all this, right? That's why, in a sense, we lionize artists, performers. Think about who our heroes are. In almost every case, the reason that we like writers, the reason we like people like Anthony Bourdain, the reason that we're attracted to these sorts of people, despite the fact that they create essentially intangible things, is because there's a sense within us that the intangible matters more than the tangible. And I can explain it to you in a way that's very simple. If I told you that you could choose between money and experiences, what would you choose? In other words, you had to pick one or the other. And you can't have both. In almost every instance, most people, unless they were desperately poor, would pick experiences, something intangible, without even knowing what those experiences would be. If I told you that you could have, let's see, if I told you you could have, we're talking about a house, or $1 million house, or someone who loves you. Most people, again, unless they're desperately poor, which, by the way, is a form of coercion, right? You don't really have freedom of choice when you're desperately poor. You have to focus on the money. If I told you that, most people who are not under duress would pick the intangible. If I told you that you could be you could be a billionaire, or you could be Zadie Smith, have the writing ability of Zadie Smith. That's probably a little bit more difficult, right? You would have to know who Zadie Smith is. You would have to be able to appreciate the abstract. And that would be a little bit more difficult. But you see how it's still a contest, even when I make the tangible in the top 1%, and I compare it to the other top 1%, you see how it's, in a sense, comparable. And again, it goes back to this idea of a valuation system that still probably favors the intangible to the extent that the individual is not under duress. And so that might be the lesson that I've been trying to teach this entire time. It's not really that you and I are rewriting history. What is really happening is this realization that overall, the United States is now, as of today, destined to fail, not just because of segregation, not just because of its continued failures to fix fundamental problems, not just because of its preference for propaganda over effective solutions. At the same time that a competing country has favored the exact opposite. Solutions, practicality, and so on. When you put all that together, it makes sense not only where this society is going, but where other societies are going as well. And the question then becomes, can the intangible rise up in a way that defeats all of these pre-existing problems? And there's a sense that perhaps it could, but again, we've already said that the reason that we're here is because the intangible has failed over and over again. It's always failed when confronted with some form of the military-industrial complex, some form that seeks to divide and govern under the guise of safety. and stability, which is, of course, what the banking sector is really after, as opposed to creativity. So there's a sense that it's possible for creativity to triumph over stability. But there's also a sense that there's no roadmap for doing so. And to the extent that there has been a roadmap, that roadmap has completely failed every single time. And so if you are on the side of the intangible, you have to understand you are on the losing side. You and me are on the losing side. And we'll always be on the losing side because of humanity's biological predilection for the visual and for the tangible over the intangible. But you also have to understand its preference can shift if we are not under duress. If we are under duress, if we are afraid, the tangible will always win. That also explains why so much of the things that we see here on the media, especially in an empire that's in decline and desperate to hold on to the status quo, especially one that favors banking stability and debt repayment, I really should say interest repayment. No one thinks that hundreds of trillions of dollars of debt will be paid off. Put all that together, and there's a sense also that our current institutions that try to harness the intangible, such as religious institutions, have also failed. And they failed also by segregating themselves. In other words, by creating a system that seeks to, not intentionally, create a separate ideology and support system from the main. And you do that in a country where the government has, for the most part, ceded welfare to nonprofits, which have a significant overlap with religion, especially the Catholic Church. You put all that together, and everything that you see now is predictable, as well as perhaps fixable. The only issue is how we're going to create a system that fixes all these things while not denigrating the individual or the power of the intangible.